Ford has told the same story for 75 years. It invented the American police car in 1950, and nobody's taken the crown since. Ford still owns 2 out of 3 police cars in America today. But in the exact years Ford claims as the birth of the pursuit car, the fastest cop car in the country wasn't a Ford. It was built by a company nobody remembers, and it beat Ford at its own game. Subscribe, because this story, about credit nobody earned, ends somewhere strange. Ford earned a head start on that reputation decades before any police package ever existed. Back in 1915, the Oakland, California police force had already standardized its entire patrol fleet around plain Model Ts, simply because Ford's cars were cheap, everywhere, and easy to keep running. Then, in the 1930s, Ford's new flathead V8 turned that reputation into something closer to folklore. It was affordable enough for almost any department to buy, but powerful enough that outlaws wanted it too. Bonnie and Clyde reportedly stole and drove Ford V8s across the Midwest during their crime spree, and John Dillinger famously escaped police custody and won. By the time the 1940s ended, Ford's cars had already spent a generation chasing criminals and occasionally driving them. The 1950 police package wasn't really where Ford's police reputation began. It was where the company finally turned an existing reputation into an actual, sellable product line. Start with the legend as Ford tells it from there, because it's mostly true, and that's what makes the rest of this so interesting. In 1950, Ford introduced the mainline sedan with a dedicated police package, heavier electrical systems to handle the new two-way radios, reinforced suspension, and engine options built specifically for continuous high-speed use. It's widely regarded as the first mass-produced, factory-built police package offered by a major American automaker, and it landed at exactly the right moment. Police departments across the country were rapidly motorizing after the Second World War, and Ford was there with an answer nobody else had built yet. The New York Police Department alone ordered more than 400 of them, reportedly the largest single police order in the country up to that point. A couple of years later, Ford started attaching a new word to its police-spec V8 engine option, Interceptor. It stuck. Through the 50s and 60s, the name rode along on Fairlanes, Galaxies, and custom 500s. And by 1961, an internal Ford survey found that roughly 58% of police cars operating in the country's 50 largest cities were already Fords, a majority position the brand has never really given up since. Ford finally put Police Interceptor directly on a car nameplate with the Crown Victoria in 1992. That car alone ran for nearly 20 years, becoming so thoroughly embedded in American culture that Crown Vic is still shorthand for unmarked police car, even among people who've never seen one in real life. When production finally ended in 2011, a fleet appraisal firm that specializes in law enforcement vehicles gave it a formal honor, Best Cop Car of all time. That record didn't stop when the Crown Victoria did, either. Ford replaced it with the Police Interceptor sedan and the Police Interceptor Utility, essentially a reinforced, pursuit-rated version of the Explorer SUV, and the Utility alone has gone on to become the best-selling police vehicle in North America. Add the F-150 police responder pickup to that lineup, and Ford now effectively offers a pursuit-rated version of nearly its entire consumer catalog, something no competitor has matched. Ford still leans on all of this today, running anniversary campaigns celebrating a continuous 75-year run in law enforcement, unbroken since that first police package in 1950. It's a genuinely impressive record. It's also, quietly, a story about who survived long enough to keep telling it, because in the very years Ford's timeline treats as the founding chapter of the American pursuit car, a different company was already building the car that actually deserved that title on merit. That company was Hudson. If the name means anything to you today, it's probably because of an animated character in a Pixar movie, not because of anything you learned about real automotive history, and that's not an accident. It's basically the entire point of this video. Hudson was a mid-sized, independent Detroit automaker, nowhere near the size of Ford, Chevrolet, or Chrysler. In 1948, on its Commodore model, Hudson introduced something called step-down construction. Instead of building a car body that sat on top of its frame rails the way almost everything else on the road did, Hudson dropped the floor pan down between the rails, so passengers literally stepped down into the car rather than climbing up into it. That sounds like a minor packaging trick, but it wasn't. It dropped the car's center of gravity dramatically, and because the body and frame were now essentially one welded unibody structure instead of two separate pieces bolted together, The whole car was noticeably stiffer and more planted through a corner than anything else being sold in America at the time. In 1951, Hudson put that chassis under a new model called the Hornet and paired it with a large flathead inline six-cylinder engine displacing 308 cubic inches. On paper, that sounds like a step backward. By the early 50s, the rest of the industry was racing toward overhead valve V8s, and a flathead 6 looked like yesterday's engineering. But that big 6 produced enormous torque low in the rev range, and combined with that impossibly low, stiff chassis, the Hornet could put power down through a corner in a way that the taller, softer V8 cars of the era simply couldn't match. A year later, Hudson added something called Twin H power, essentially a dual carburetor setup, which pushed output from around 145 horsepower up to roughly 170, still less peak power than some rival V8s. On a twisty dirt track, it didn't matter, because the Hornet could carry that power through the corners at a speed nothing else could touch. To picture why the chassis mattered so much, think about the difference between carrying a heavy box up on your shoulders versus carrying that same box down at your waist. A traditional body-on-frame car of the era sat its passenger compartment up on top of the chassis rails, which worked fine in a straight line, but gave the whole car a high center of gravity that wanted to tip sideways under hard cornering. Hudson's step-down design tucked that same weight down between the rails instead, closer to the road, so the car had far less leverage working against it in a turn. Every major manufacturer would eventually move toward unibody construction for exactly this reason, but in 1951, Hudson had already been selling the idea in dealer showrooms for 3 years, while its rivals were still catching up. For comparison, Ford's own police spec flathead V8 in this same period, the engine that had just been given the Interceptor name, was producing around 110 horsepower. Hudson's inline 6 was already competitive with that number on paper, and once Twin H power arrived, it was outproducing Ford's police engine by a real margin, all while sitting inside a chassis specifically built to turn that power into cornering speed rather than just straight-line acceleration. On the kind of curving two-lane highway a 1950s state trooper actually worked, that combination mattered a great deal more than a horsepower figure on a spec sheet. That advantage came with a catch, though. Twin H power's dual carburetors needed careful, regular tuning to stay balanced against each other, and if they drifted out of sync, the engine could actually lose efficiency instead of gaining it. Race teams with a mechanic like Smokey Yunick on staff got the full benefit every time. A smaller department without the budget for that extra attention sometimes never saw what made the car special in the first place, which, in hindsight, is a small preview of how Hudson would eventually lose the bigger argument too, one budget line at a time. Here's the part where sounds fast turns into hard proof, because nobody had to take Hudson's word for it. NASCAR in the early 1950s was brutally simple. Whatever you could buy off a dealer's lot was, more or less, what you raced. No purpose-built race chassis, no factory-fabricated tube frames. The family sedan under the hood on Monday was the same one crossing the finish line on Sunday. That made NASCAR an unusually honest engineering test, and in 1951, a Daytona local and mechanic named Marshall Teague borrowed a brand-new Hornet from a Florida dealership and won the season-opening race outright. It was Hudson's first NASCAR win, and it wouldn't be close to the last. Teague didn't do it alone. He worked with a mechanic named Smokey Yunick, who would go on to become one of the most legendary tuners in American racing history. And together the two of them worked out exactly how far Hudson's flathead 6 and step-down chassis could be pushed. Teague was good enough behind the wheel to be named the AAA's Stock Car Driver of the Year for 1951, and after a falling out with NASCAR's founder, Bill France, midway through the following season, he simply took the same Hudson package over to a rival sanctioning body and kept winning national titles there too, in 1952 and again in 1954. It didn't seem to matter which organization was running the race. The car underneath him kept winning it regardless. None of this was an accident on Hudson's side, either. 1950s. Detroit had already discovered the idea that would later get nicknamed Win on Sunday, Sell on Monday, the belief that a manufacturer's race day performance translated directly into showroom sales the following week. Hudson leaned into that logic harder than almost any manufacturer its size, treating its factory racing program less like a hobby and more like an actual marketing department. For a company that couldn't outspend Ford on traditional advertising, a trophy case full of NASCAR championships was the cheapest, loudest billboard it could buy. Driver Herb Thomas took over as Hudson's most dominant weapon on the NASCAR side that same year, switching from a Plymouth to a Hornet partway through the season and winning the 1951 NASCAR championship. He wasn't just fast, he became the first owner-driver in the sport's short history to win a title, doing it in a car anyone could theoretically walk into a Hudson dealership and buy. In 1952, driver Tim Flock took the crown, also behind the wheel of a Hornet, edging out Thomas himself in one of the closest points battles of the decade. Thomas came back in 1953 and won again, becoming NASCAR's first-ever two-time champion. Put those 3 seasons together, and Hudson had claimed 3 consecutive manufacturer titles in a row, at a moment when Ford and Chrysler were both fielding their brand-new, much more powerful V8 engines and getting beaten anyway. By most tallies, the Hornet won the large majority of top-level NASCAR races run in 1952 alone, commonly cited as 27 wins out of that season's 34 Grand National events. That's not a company getting lucky. That's a smaller manufacturer, with a fraction of Ford's engineering budget, building a genuinely superior chassis, and beating Detroit's giants on the exact kind of demanding, high-speed, corner-heavy driving that police pursuit work actually requires. And it wasn't only proving itself on a racetrack. Hudson Hornets did see real police duty during this same window. Documented examples include a 1954 Hornet Coupe running with the Ohio State Highway Patrol, alongside additional Hornets confirmed in service with various county sheriff's departments and township police units around the same years. To be clear about the scale here, Hudson never came close to Ford's or Chevrolet's enormous statewide fleet contracts. This wasn't a company challenging for the national police car market, but the cars that did wear a badge were proving, on real roads, the same advantage the racetrack had already demonstrated. A car built low, stiff, and torquey enough to run down almost anything else on the highway, at the exact moment Ford's official timeline says its own police package was just getting started. Around these same years, other independent manufacturers were chasing the same law enforcement contracts on a similarly small scale. Studebaker supplied units to its hometown department in South Bend, Indiana, and Kaiser sold cars to Ohio's own highway patrol fleet in this same period. Ford and Chevrolet's eventual lock on police contracts wasn't inevitable from day one. It was a market several companies were still actively fighting over in the early 1950s, and for a few short years, Hudson had a genuine engineering case for winning that fight outright. None of that corporate math mattered in the moment to a trooper actually behind the wheel. What mattered was which car got him to a wreck 2 minutes sooner, or let him run down a driver who already had a head start. On that measure, for those few years, the honest answer was the Hudson, not the Ford, even if almost nobody buying a fleet order that year was making the decision on that basis. If you're enjoying this kind of, the story is more complicated than the brand tells it deep dive, there's a lot more automotive history sitting in exactly the same gray area. Hit follow so the next one finds you. So, if Hudson genuinely had the better chassis, the better handling, and a stack of championships to prove it during the precise years Ford's founding myth is set in, why does absolutely nobody associate Hudson with the American police car today? The honest answer has almost nothing to do with engineering, and everything to do with money. Hudson was an independent. It didn't have Ford's dealer network, Ford's manufacturing scale, or Ford's cash reserves, and by the early 1950s, that gap was becoming a serious problem. Racing success sold cars in the short term, but it was expensive to sustain, and Hudson was simultaneously trying to fund a completely different new model, the compact jet, in a bid to diversify away from an aging full-size lineup. The company simply didn't have the capital to keep doing both. In 1954, Hudson merged with another struggling independent Nash Kelvinator to form American Motors Corporation (AMC). Hudson's Detroit factory closed down, and while the Hornet name limped on for a few more years under AMC's ownership, it was discontinued entirely by 1957. As an independent engineering voice, Hudson was gone barely 3 years after Herb Thomas's second championship. None of Hudson's racing success ever translated into anything close to Ford's production scale to begin with across its entire run. Hudson built the Hornet in the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of thousands, and it never had a real shot at unseating Ford's police package as a nationwide fleet standard even at its competitive peak. Scale and merit are two different arguments though, and it's worth being precise about which one actually collapsed in 1954. Hudson didn't lose the argument about which chassis handled better under pursuit conditions. It lost the argument about which company still had the capital to keep building either car at all. Police procurement in the 1950s was never really an engineering competition the way a NASCAR points table was, either. Departments bought in bulk, on fixed municipal budgets, from whichever manufacturer could guarantee a nationwide dealer network for spare parts, predictable delivery schedules, and a price the city council would actually approve. Ford could offer all three at a scale no independent automaker could realistically match, regardless of how a given engine or chassis performed on a Sunday afternoon in front of 10,000 spectators. A police chief weighing next year's fleet order wasn't picking the fastest car in the state. He was picking the car his department could still get parts for 5 years later, without a struggling manufacturer disappearing on him, which, it turned out, was a real risk with Hudson, and not a hypothetical one. Ford's police program, meanwhile, never stopped for a single year. No merger, no discontinued nameplate, no gap in the timeline for a historian to have to explain. It just kept running, generation after generation. The 1971 Galaxy carried a massive 7-liter V8 for departments like the California Highway Patrol. The 1982 Mustang SSP was fast enough that Ford's own advertising bragged the car could chase down a Porsche for a living, and highway patrols bought it specifically to catch import sports cars nothing else in the fleet could keep up with. Then came the LTD Crown Victoria, and finally the Crown Victoria Police Interceptor that would go on to dominate the market for 2 full decades. Every one of those cars got to add another chapter to the exact same continuous story, reinforced by decades of advertising, museum retrospectives, and anniversary campaigns that Ford is still actively running today. Hudson's story, by contrast, simply stopped being told by anyone with a marketing budget, because there was no company left standing to keep telling it. That's really the whole mechanism right there. Credit in corporate history isn't necessarily assigned to whoever built the better product in a given year. It's assigned to whoever survives long enough and stays profitable enough to keep repeating the story until it hardens into accepted fact. And once you notice that pattern, it's worth pulling on it a little further, because Ford's own first claim has a similar soft spot hiding underneath it. Ford is routinely credited, including in its own official materials, as having built the first American police car with its 1950 police package, but the very first documented motorized police vehicle in the United States predates that by more than 50 years, and it wasn't built by Ford either. In 1899, the police department in Akron, Ohio put an electric wagon into service, built by a company called the Collins Buggy Company. It weighed roughly 5,000 pounds, topped out at around 16 miles an hour, and came equipped with a holding cage for prisoners and a gong to serve as a siren. By most accounts, it was eventually destroyed, pushed into the Ohio River during a riot, which is either a fitting or a slightly ironic way for the actual first American police car to disappear from the record. What Ford genuinely pioneered in 1950 wasn't the concept of a police car that already existed by then in scattered, improvised form for decades. What Ford pioneered was the factory-built police package, sold nationally, as a defined product category, with consistent specifications a department could simply order from a catalog. That's a real and meaningful achievement. It is not, strictly speaking, inventing the cop car, and the gap between those two claims is exactly the kind of thing that gets quietly smoothed over once a company has 75 years and a marketing department behind it. Ford keeps that smoothing over process running today. The 75th anniversary campaign it ran recently walks through the entire lineage again: the 1950 mainline, the Interceptor name, the muscle-era Galaxies, the Crown Vic, and every retelling reinforces the same uninterrupted narrative for a new generation of viewers who've never heard of Hudson at all. Meanwhile, the one place Hudson's actual legacy survives in anything close to mainstream culture is almost an accident of animation. In 2006, Pixar released the film Cars, built around a grizzled small-town doctor named Doc Hudson, a character explicitly modeled on the real fabulous Hudson Hornet and its driver, Herb Thomas. Millions of kids who've watched that movie can picture the car. Almost none of them, or their parents, could tell you it's based on a real 1951 race car that beat Ford's own products on merit, or that the company behind it collapsed just a few years after building it. In 2022, the surviving 1952 Hornet that carried Herb Thomas and Smokey Yunick's tuning to victory was formally enshrined in the National Historic Vehicle Register, with its story permanently archived through the Library of Congress, a serious, if quiet, acknowledgement that the car's engineering achievement was real. That kind of institutional recognition doesn't reach anywhere near the audience a 75th anniversary marketing campaign does, though. The real story got folded into a cartoon almost by accident, and today that cartoon is doing more to keep Hudson's name circulating than any preservation archive most people will never encounter. So here's where all of this actually lands. Ford's 75-year police car reign is real, And it's genuinely earned in the sense that matters most to a police department buying thousands of cars: consistency, dealer support, parts availability, and a track record department heads could trust decade after decade. None of that is fake, but earned the market and earned the engineering credit for that specific golden era turn out to be two different claims, and only one of them is actually true. For a few short years, right at the start of Ford's own origin story, a smaller, underfunded competitor built a genuinely better handling, better proven pursuit car, ran it to 3 straight national championships against Detroit's biggest names, and even put a few of them into real police service, and then went bankrupt before it could turn any of that into a lasting reputation. Ford didn't have to beat that car in a straight fight to end up with the credit for the era. It just had to still be standing 75 years later to keep telling its version of the story, while nobody was left standing to tell Hudson's. If you wanted to split the actual credit fairly, it would probably look something like this. Ford deserves real credit for inventing the police package as a nationwide, catalog-ready product, and for the sheer discipline of never once letting that product line lapse for 75 straight years. Hudson deserves credit for something narrower but no less real for a few short seasons, building the single best handling, best proven pursuit chassis in the entire country, and beating every one of Detroit's giants, Ford included, on the only scoreboard that didn't care which company had the bigger advertising budget. This same pattern shows up well outside of cop cars, too. Anywhere a surviving company gets to write the official history of an entire category, the brand that's still around to run the anniversary campaign almost always ends up sounding like the brand that started everything, whether or not that's strictly what happened. Hudson isn't a special case. It's just an unusually well-documented one, because a racetrack and a points table left a paper trail that a marketing department couldn't quietly edit out. That's really the bigger lesson sitting underneath one company's police car anniversary campaign. A lot of what gets accepted as the first or the best in any industry isn't actually a clean engineering verdict handed down at the time. It's a story that got repeated by whoever was still around, profitable, and motivated enough to keep repeating it, year after year, until repetition started to look exactly like fact. Next time a brand tells you it invented something, it's worth asking a quieter follow-up question, not whether the claim is a lie, but whether it's simply the version that happened to survive. If this kind of brand history myth-busting is your thing, there's a full back catalog of it waiting for you, so stick around and see what else doesn't quite hold up.